my name is Jules Glascoe. I'm a senior. A year and a half ago, the Lord saved my soul, and I want to tell you the good news. So I grew up going to church, and I attended a Christian school. So I had always been taught about the Bible and the cliche Bible stories, but I was never actually taught the gospel in depth. I hadn't really heard the full story of how God sent Jesus to live a perfect life on earth, and he lived that perfect life with experiencing temptation but never actually giving into that sin, and how he then died on the cross after being tortured, and he rose 3 days later, and how because of that we can have forgiveness and we can be saved, but I had never actually heard of that. So I just believed that if you believed that God was a real person and was God of your life, you're a Christian, and that was basically the extent of it. So I kept living my life of sin, enslaved to my anger and sexual immorality, and I would lie, I would swear, all these things. I was disobedient to my parents, but I hadn't really realized they were sins because I was told I was a good person. I went to church, I attended a Christian school, and I believed in God. So therefore, I was a Christian, but that wasn't real, that wasn't true, because I hadn't repented, I hadn't turned from my sin to Christ. It wasn't until my whole family got invited to Compass. We went, and it was weird. People were talking to me, they were acting like they wanted to know about my life, and I was like, this is weird, I am deeply uncomfortable. But it was cool because I wasn't alone, and which I had totally thought it was just gonna be me and my friend, but it wasn't. So I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'll come back. They seemed like they cared about me. So then I ended up coming back, and I was coming up until we left for Awakening, except we didn't leave. It got postponed and rescheduled to be a Christmas camp. So I saw this as an opportunity to get to know the people I would be spending the week with more. But meanwhile, I was living 2 different lives. I was putting up a mask at United, but when I was not at United, when I was at school, when I was at home, I was my same sinful self. I was still enslaved to that anger and that sexual immorality, lying, swearing, all these things. But I didn't bring it to the surface. It was more stuff I kept inside. So it got to the point where as I kept coming, I got convicted from the sermons, but I didn't realize it was conviction. So I just stopped coming for a little bit, up until Christmas camp finally came around the corner, and I was I think it was a couple days before we left, and I was like, Mom, Dad, I don't want to go. Can we not do this? Let's just get our money back. I'm not going. No way I'm going. Because my excuse was that I didn't have friends, that I didn't know anybody, but that wasn't the truth. It was just what I kept lying to myself and making myself believe. I was like, oh, okay. The first sermon, I was like, oh, we're actually we're getting preached the Bible at a Christian Bible camp, because all the camps I had gone to before, we didn't do that as much as we did. It was more games focused, and while we still had games, it was also Bible focused. So I remember I was getting really convicted, so I kind of tuned things out. But it wasn't until Wednesday night, when it was actually a testimony night, it wasn't a specific sermon that hit me, but it was seeing the change in people's lives. And a verse that stood out to me was 2 Corinthians 5:17, how if you are a new creation, you have been set apart, you're different. The old has passed away, the new has come. And I had really realized there was no difference in my life. I had never been made a new creation. I was still the same person that I was 10 years ago than I am now. So that's what really cut to me, and we eventually broke up into our small groups and we shared our testimonies. And I knew that it could go one of two ways. I could either say that I had been saved because I grew up going to church and I attended a Christian school, so therefore I was a Christian. And that's totally what I had set myself on saying. But then when it came to my turn to speak, I said that I had never been a Christian because I was never saved. I don't have a testimony. I think I had always known that I wasn't a Christian, like once I started coming to United specifically, but I didn't really like admit that to myself or to anybody until Christmas camp. So once I realized, I was like, oh, so everything I've been living for and this and that, like it's not true of me. Like I've never been a Christian. I feel like from coming to United, I had heard of like the gospel and repentance and faith, but I didn't really realize what that truly meant until Christmas camp. I think it was when people were sharing their testimonies and they were saying how clear of a difference their life has been, how they were living for themselves and and then now they're living for the Lord. And I realized that I'd always been living for myself and I'd never been living for the Lord. Like, yeah, I knew he existed and was there, but I was never actually living for him. I'd never turned from my old ways to Christ. I feel like once it clicked, I was like, I didn't know if I wanted to actually become a Christian because I loved my sin so much. But once we did break into those small groups and once I really reflected on those testimonies and seeing how great their life has changed, I think that's when I realized, like, I don't want to live for myself anymore, but I want to live for God. The Lord definitely softened my heart and opened my eyes to realize that these things weren't true of me, but they were true. I just never applied them to my life. So then my small group leader started taking me through what it would look like, how my life would drastically change. Like I couldn't keep living for myself and for the world and all these sins that I was enslaved to. Like I had to put them to death every single day. And I realized that that's what I wanted because I knew that I never found like satisfaction in my sin. And if I did find a little bit of satisfaction, it was only temporary. But from what my small group leader was telling me and from what the Bible said, it showed that like I will find satisfaction with God and it won't be temporary. It will be forever. So in that moment, I decided that that's how I wanted to live. I wanted to kill my sin and all these stuff that were like holding me down and leading me to death. And in that moment, I cried out to the Lord and repented of my sins. And ever since then, there's been a drastic change in my life. I don't think I realized how good the Lord is and how good living for the Lord is. I thought that like the people who said they were Christians like just like faked some stuff. They were like, oh yeah, like this burden was lifted off my shoulders, like, oh, my life has drastically changed. But you don't realize that that actually is true until you've gotten to that point and you're living for Christ and you're like, wow, like life is so much better. So in that moment, I decided that that's how I wanted to live. I wanted to kill my sin and all these stuff that were like holding me down and leading me to death. And in that moment, I cried out to the Lord and repented of my sins. And ever since then, there's been a drastic change in my life. I'm no longer living for myself or for this world, but I'm living for God. I'm putting to death my sin every single day. Where I was enslaved to my anger, I'm now like calm, and I have that rescue type thing where I don't have to live for my angry self. My sexual immorality, I don't give into it as much as I did then. I was totally enslaved, but now I have freedom from that. It's not what I want anymore. My desires have changed completely. I don't desire things of this world, but I do desire things of the Lord and things that He has promised. And I'm no longer disobedient to my parents. I obey them, and I know that whatever they say goes. I get to obey them daily and do those chores even if I don't feel like doing it, but have servant's heart and serve the Lord in whatever I'm doing. I feel like this past year and a half has been so much greater than all of the years I spent before. So much greater than those 15 years for many reasons. Just the Lord working through me and changing my life and drastically, not only what my desires were, but now what they are. And just seeing that change in my life and seeing this joy that couldn't have come from anything else, but it's coming from the Lord, and I can see it in my life. Yeah, I would definitely say that the night the Lord saved me was definitely the best night of my life.